I'm very happy, delighted to be presenting Antoine Picon, who is the G. Ware Troublestead Professor of the History of Architecture and Technology at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Antoine Picon is also chair of the Fondation Le Corbusier, and he is a member of the French Academy of Technology. A few of his publications are Digital Culture in Architecture from 2010, Ornament, The Politics of Architecture and Subjectivity from 2013, and Smart Cities, A Specialized Intelligence from 2015. Please join me in welcoming Antoine Picon to our colloquium on exactitude.
So, I've entitled this talk, Humans, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Design. And artificial intelligence will play the role of, the exact machine in my story. So with the rapid development of digital technologies, a very common question is about what they will be able to achieve in the near future using artificial intelligence. But another crucial problem has to do with the roles that the human will play in the design process in a few decades from now if AI spreads. There are today raging debates regarding artificial intelligence and its real possibilities, while some see no limit to what artificial intelligence will be able to do soon. Others insist, to the contrary, on the current limitations of artificial intelligence and the difficulty that will be met when trying to lift these limitations. So I'd like to assume here, as a working hypothesis, that AI will become a pervasive reality in design, and I would like to examine a number of questions that this development will raise. The central one is really about the role of the humans in such a context. We talk a lot these days about the importance of being less human-centered, about the need to treat non-humans with the fairness we usually reserve to humans. But the truth is that we're still very much humans, and that we are more than ever preoccupied by questions such as finding and keeping jobs, being able to express ourselves in a creative way. So hence my question, what about the role of the human? If we consider again AI as a possible incarnation of exactitude, what could be its limits? So it's a kind of neo-Ruskinian question, if you want, not necessarily with Ruskin nostalgic take on the past, but trying to really deal with the role of humans in a world experiencing a new wave or about to experience a new wave of mechanization. But before addressing it, I would like to begin by an apparently naive interrogation. Why is it that we want so much to automate not only fabrication, but also large parts of the design process itself? Why is it that we are gradually passing from a discourse on robots to a discourse on artificial intelligence in architecture? So why are we so keen on automating design? The truth is that automation is perhaps not an entirely rational enterprise. It is all the more unavoidable that it is rooted in something else than rational calculation. Or it may be that rationality is never completely rational, that it obeys impulses that we do not necessarily control. We tend to believe that automation and the quest for exactitude that goes with it is entirely objective. Actually, it is grounded in something more profound that has to do with the recognition that there are forces in the world that go far beyond the usual factors that shape our action and production. How to be plugged into these forces was a question that the Surrealists had tried to raise through their practice of écriture automatique, automatic writing. The reason I'm mentioning the Surrealists is not only because of their use of the notion of automatic writing and more generally automatic creation as a way to go beyond ordinary artistic production in order to tap into more fundamental forces such as those that move the unconscious. Another reason is that among their disciple was a young intellectual who was later to become one of the major post-war French sociologists, Pierre Naville. After the war, Naville worked on automation in the industry. He was a keen observer of the transformation that were affecting the French automobile industry. But while doing empirical work on what was happening on the workshop floor, he remained sensitive to what the surrealist had taught him. That led him to a famous statement in a piece called Vers l'automatisme social, towards social automatism, published in the early 1960s, in which he wrote, "I'm not far to believe, despite the violent rejection that it often provokes, that automatism represents an archetype as ancient and radical as our sense of symmetry or cycle, that it touches something intimate in us, a vibrant chord of our creative power, that it has to do with enchantment, with our will to power, and many other impulses that move us, starting from our unconscious." So for Naville, automation was ultimately about this pursuit of automatism. It had to do with a quest for spontaneity usually reserved to natural being. It was, according to his own word, an attempt to make nature do by itself, through machines harnessing its power, what humans wanted it to do. It appeared as a Promethean quest that could never be fully satisfied by our technology, as sophisticated as it could be, for it possessed a foundational and even mythical character. So envisaged from this perspective, automation corresponds to something far more fundamental than the ambition to improve efficiency and exactitude, or it reveals rather what is the true purpose of our endless quest for efficiency and exactitude. It has to do with a desire to create something that can rival nature, living beings in particular. Another way to put it is to say that automation has to do with a desire to animate matter, to surround oneself with creatures that seem endowed with something reminding us of life. The most extreme form is, of course, when this life becomes similar to ours. And there are multiple legend and work of fiction that illustrate the enduring character of this theme. Think of Pygmalion, the Golem, or, in many ways, Frankenstein. From the start, robots were inheritor of this tradition. Think of Fritz Lang's Metropolis and its robot that seem endowed with a diabolical life. The question of the relation between robots and life has, of course, known a new development with artificial intelligence and deep learning. It is, by the way, telling that the evocation of contrary robots and artificial intelligence oscillates between the profoundly non-human character of algorithm and the way humans, children in particular, learn. Now, let me turn to architecture. Architecture has both an intimate and complex relation to the question of animation. The myth of Amphion is all about animation, since Amphion builds the wall of Troy by playing the lute, and the blocks then spontaneously begin to move. Something, of course, that we have forgotten is that the traditional analogy between architecture and music had to do with animation. Architecture tries to animate matter so that it can enter in a dialogic relation with humans. It can dialogue with humans. This is what ornament used to be about. But ornament was not alone. Composition had also to do with it. And the Baroque was certainly not the only one type of composition concerned by this quest. So for a very long time, architecture had to do with animation, but an animation leaving aside the question of automatism and automation. As an immobile animation, it was very different in that respect from other domains, from technology in particular. Now, it is striking to observe how what has happened in the past decades or two may be characterized by a dramatic shift in those relations between architecture and animation. Animation in architecture has become inseparable from the question of automation. It is pushing the limits of architecture with, for example, the development of interactive spaces like here. Pushing towards the limit, we may go as far as to imagine architecture acquiring something like a life of its own in an almost literal sense. So what has happened in architecture recently could be in some ways described not only as a technological evolution, but as a reactivation of powerful mythical forces. And I'll return to the myth toward the end of this presentation. This mythical character explains probably why the relation between automation and architecture is complex and even contradictory. The power of myth lies in their capacity to host contradictory dimensions, just like dreams. So far, the most salient phenomenon has been the development of digital fabrication. Now, and this will be what I will mostly discuss in the rest of this presentation, we could very well be on the eve of an automation of the design task proper with a rise of AI. So under what condition is the development of AI in architecture possible? So let me begin by some basic conditions that will need to be fulfilled in order to have truly intelligent design machine. So we all know that we'll need big data so that machine can learn. And a number of designers around the world, for example, Andrew Witt at the GSD, are exploring what this means concretely. A doctoral dissertation are multiplying on the subject of machine vision, machine learning in architecture. This is an illustration from a recent dissertation at EPFL from a guy from Singapore. So far, not everything is convincing in all these labyrinthic composition, but they do raise new questions. If they ingest large enough databases of types, tectonic details, ornament, AI programs may be able to produce design of their own. What will they produce? They may combine things that we don't usually combine, Baroque elements with modernist ones, for instance. So two questions arise from this situation. Will we be able to understand the way machine reason? It's not only a matter of algorithm, the elements on which the machine base itself may differ from ours profoundly. Think of the way different languages understand already differently the physical world. So we're beginning to see that in the realm of cities. For example, machines see different things than us, clouds of traces of events in particular, and this is very much what urban big data is about. And what makes sense for a machine is not necessarily what makes sense for us. This is not a recent problem, actually. Think of calculus in the 18th century. You know, calculus was seen as a mysterious set of practices bordering the meaningless. But these questions seem to be difficult to avoid today. So should we impose the same rules that we are following to the machine? Should we force it to consider the same types of elements? This may limit or even hamper its creativity. With machines following our rules, we will soon have computers who are able to produce tolerable Baroque churches or modernist villas, but is it what we want? Even if it's what the building industry may want, you know, this might by the end not be the best way to use AI. So all that to say that a central question is actually how will we be truly able to communicate with machines? In other words, how can we have an architectural conversation with them? And I'd like to remind you that architecture is ultimately a conversation. This is what Philibert Delorme had in mind with his plate on the good architect. The good architect is somebody who enters in dialogue, not only with the students, but with the buildings. So this is more difficult than we may think, because if the machine is too much like us, what's the point of the conversation? And the same question arises if actually the machine is too different. So this revolves around the question of otherness, one of the most profound in creation. To create, one must allow something foreign to be born inside us, next to us. I is an other, to use the poet Arthur Rimbaud's famous expression. So we could imagine this another to be carried by the machine, or rather to be born from a conversation with a machine. But this is, of course, you know, a challenging issue. Again, it presupposes that the machine should neither be too different nor too similar to us. So let's assume at this stage that machines will be able, so that's just an hypothesis, but for the sake of it, to do more and more. It seems reasonable to assume that in most cases, we will impose by the end to the machine to consider elements and to follow rules that are somewhat similar or at least compatible with those that we have adopted in the building industry and in architecture. One has thought so far that automation would impact only poorly qualified jobs. This might not be the case. Architecture could be among the most impacted disciplines. The reason for this is that architecture is among the most formalized of all the arts. The mechanical part, as one used to say, is stronger than in other domains, hence its traditional position between art and technology. And the very use of order and proportion by the Vitruvian tradition seems to be already calling for automation. The later project of Durand to codify design procedure could be an even clearer forerunner of the reflection on the possibility to use computer for design. And British architect Cedric Price's approach to projects in the 1960s and 1970s seemed also to announce an era of machine involvement in design. From Durand to Cedric Price, and from Cedric Price to machine learning, it would be tempting actually to draw such a genealogy. It is envisageable that once all these challenges that I mentioned before are solved, machine will at least be able to be partner, perhaps more. And it's worth remembering that in the early ages of the computer, it was actually a widely spread belief. Nicolas Negroponte Architecture Machine Group at MIT was, for example, animated by such a belief. Retrospectively, the period during which computer and robots were considered as mere tools could appear as a parenthesis in a long march toward a true cooperation between man and machine. Again, it's not sure that intelligent design machine will reason like humans. This means that as important as their intrinsic power to produce design solution will be their capacity to enter in relation with us, again, to have a conversation. And it's interesting that this theme of the conversation was actually of interest to the architecture machine group that promoted such an idea. And this is the reason, by the way, that Negroponte's group turned to interface question and gave birth eventually to the Media Lab. So intelligence will probably not be limited to design proper. Construction will be also impacted. So far, robots are no more than mechanical slaves. One may imagine that they will acquire some autonomy and even intelligence eventually. And then it might be interesting to see whether we see the rise of a disagreement between these various forms of intelligence. Design could very well remain a conversation, but between whom is a fundamental question. So this leads me back to the question with which I started of what could remain specifically human in the future of design that I've been trying to sketch. It's not very easy because just like the debates regarding quantification and its rise, it's always tempting to play the humanist to say, you know what, there are so many things that cannot be quantified. But we see with cities that actually quantification is on the rise, and we're beginning to see text written by computers. Not very brilliant for sure, but they do already exist. So what is specifically human? The question is, of course, complicated by the fact that since we invent machine, there is something partly mechanical in the way we think. And this obsessed a philosopher like Diderot. It was actually the source of his interest for the mechanical arts in the encyclopedia. For him, to describe a machine as he did with a lot of detail for the machine to knit stockings on the right was to try to answer this question. The reason for Diderot, the reason that we can design machines is that we think partially like them. And this includes this capacity for inner otherness. Another way to put it would be to say that the machine embody, the I is another principle. They embody our inner otherness. So if we're partly resembling machines, what can be unique to what we bring to the table? So the easy answer is so far to note that we're still very much a generalist intelligence, and neuroscientists have written a lot about that, and that the path toward the kind of all-purpose brain that we possess is still to a large extent to be explored. But let's again assume for the sake of the argument that we will have more powerful and generalist AI in the near future. Then what about humans? Perhaps two things. First, we have an embodied intelligence. Our conception and practices of the bodies are eminently variable for sure, but to be human is to have a body. And so far, this is a real limitation for robots and artificial intelligence. Because we have a body, we have emotion that mix the purely physical and the mental. Memory and all cognitive function mix in a very similar way the physical and the cognitive. Finally, this is what produces relevance and also these series of echoes in each other's mind that we call meaning. It is telling that for a very long time, architecture was interpreted as what happened when buildings were able to connect with us through some affinity with our body. More generally, the symbolic is very often connected to our body. So I would probably assign to the humans the task to decide what truly matters, to choose among a range of possible solutions produced by the machine, to choose what seems the most relevant to humans. In other words, a shift from tactics to strategy, from the how to the why, from exactitude to relevance. This shift has already begun to happen with the diffusion of digital tools, with the rise of parametric design in particular that may produce all kinds of solutions. In that case, the real decision-making has to do with selecting what are the questions, again, the why. So architecture then becomes a question of choice, something akin to a form of action. So the machine produces and the humans actually act, which is, so humans made choices that have to do with how the physical and the symbolic are actually co-emergent. And the interaction between the physical and the symbolic is what makes possible this notion of inhabiting. A lot of beings can occupy a space, but humans have the relatively unique capacity to inhabit it. This is what humans may have to do in the future, making choices about inhabiting. So what I'm advocating would be, in a way, a kind of return to the phenomenological, with a difference that it would not be in reference to a completely static conception of what constitutes the human. And I'd like also to raise the issue that the lack of complex embodiment of AI may be temporary. Again, there is nothing dictated by a fixed nature, but constructs in a continuous evolution, human constructs and artificial constructs. This means that the distribution of the task between humans and machine is to a large extent a construct, a political construct. To be human is to construct men and women as political, and we need actually to go beyond that. We need urgently to redefine the politics of design, envisage as the relation between the various actors, human and non-human. And we may have one day to truly associate non-humans to the process. So let me return to the myth. In architecture, myth and poetics have a particularly strong connection. Technology in architecture has no relevance if it does not plug into poetics and myth. This was, by the way, the case with industrialization at the apex of modernism. Industrialization was never about rationalization only. It was about plugging into a broader dynamism. It was about poetics. So it's probably too early to say how this poetic dimension will play out. But let me note one thing. Usually, architectural poetics play on the margin of the new productive system. The dream of a reinvented craftsmanship haunted modernity and industrialization. So the question then becomes, what will be the margins of an AI-driven design? So a possible path, and Alicia evoked similar things, could be the introduction of glitches, the perturbation of the exactitude of machine design, This imperfection having to do again with a couple body and meaning. And it's quite interesting, I said at the beginning that it was a kind of neo-Ruskinian reflection, that this kind of reflection was present in Ruskin reflection, or Ruskin theorization of ornament, or later in Le Corbusier's fascination with the imperfection of concrete that made manifest the presence of humans. So what could imperfection mean in a new machine age? The theme has been repeatedly explored by all kinds of designers. But we could also invert the roles and have the machine itself produce disconcerting glitches and objects that, perturbates common perception. And we're back to this idea of negotiation and also conversation with machines. Speaking of conversation, why not imagine that buildings themselves could have eventually something to say? How about an AI, the body of which could be buildings, home in particular? And here we have, of course, the reflection of Cedric Price when he tried to elaborate this generator project, in which, in some ways, the building was becoming the body of a resident AI. So ultimately, we might want to question also in a critical way what will be probably, at least for a certain time, at the core of the role played by humans in an AI-driven design world inhabiting. Because are we going to keep the monopoly of that? Questioning the fringes of established practices and belief, reinventing the mythical might involve a critique of inhabiting as we have known it so far. It's quite interesting, by the way, that science fiction novels and movies are presenting us with multiple images of life with artificial companions with whom we inhabit. This is, of course, taken from the movie Ex Machina, but there are so many other examples. So I'd like to conclude by saying that design is among the key dimensions that makes us human. And it will probably remain so in this new machine age that I have tried to evoke. Because to be human might have to do with the fact that we're never sure of what it means exactly. I is another who might not, after all, be human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoine. You've taken us into a future that's, very close to the present. There's a science fiction for today, and you've given us a lot of food for thought as we think of all these important issues. I just wanted to make a comment and ask a question. You mentioned surrealism at first, and a lot of your talk reminded me of the surrealist idea that we're not just looking at objects or buildings, in the case of architecture, but they're also looking back at us. That's the impression you get when you look at many surrealist artworks. Is that something, and you're really inviting us to think not from within the limitations of our human minds, but to think this kind of radical otherness that's machine otherness, or the point of view of machines. How do you think that's possible? How can machines look back at us or talk back to us? I'm just trying to picture this conversation.
There are a number of possible answers. One, which is the easy one, is to say a little bit after Diderot, we invented the machine. And the machine is what in us is this radical otherness that enables to have a creative conversation. Because if we're only in a solipsist conversation with ourselves, we will never invent something new. So we need to find within ourselves something which is radically different from us. So in some ways, that's the role of the machine or the object, etc. And I think this is part of the surrealist thing. And then there is a more complex, probably philosophical thing in which, in some ways, the very fact that you perceive something as an object is already linked to the fact that it's about to address you, which was, a kind of German idealist theme at some point. But I do think the very fact that you perceive something as an object means that you're engaging a conversation.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
So I know that this is not the central topic of your talk, but I find this idea fascinating of if we're shifting from knowing how to the why. What are your observations about how this unfolds in the pedagogical arena? In other words, I think at least for now, we're mainly training people for the how and not so much for the why. And so how do you think this will transform the way architecture is taught and internalized before it goes back to the practice?
Difficult question. You know, I'm not a social reformer, but I do think we need to rethink very profoundly. You know, it's clear that with machines, you know, a large part of the technicity of the art, you know, the technicalities of the art, which define skills, for example, may be shifted to non-human help, etc. So what remains is actually the strategic dimension. But this is actually true already. Whoever has a large architectural practice will very often actually, you know, be producing through conversation with the people she employs. You know, I'm always struck by the fact that large architectural practices, you know, conversation is very often a more important tool than drawing. You know, at the beginning, and so that then, and this is also what I meant. So in some ways, you know, art AI is, of course, will be a change, but, you know, we're already using natural intelligences, you know, in architectural practice. I think, for example, this idea of conversation for me is quite central. That, you know, we have been too much focusing on architecture as a, you know, crafting a masterpiece, and not enough as architecture as, you know, the platform for a conversation.
Okay, very good. I'd just like to ask what might be the role of economics in the whole, I suppose, equation and unfolding of the future of AI and, you know, the cost analysis, for instance, in the R&D of AI, and then the application of AI to design, if you know that might shift or inflect the course of the way that AI is developed and used.
I completely agree, and I have to declare my total incompetence. To be honest, that's a question I'm already sometimes tempted to raise with robots. That's to say, you know, robots in architecture so far, you know, the orange arms are producing, you know, lots of interesting stuff, but truth is labor is still cheaper in many respects. So will labor remain cheaper? Actually, what interests me in AI, strangely, just like robots, not so far the idea that, you know, the idea that the future could be completely populated with robots and AI interests me a little bit like, you know, in the 18th century philosophy, use the origin. So I use the future as a way for me, which might never exist, but actually I don't care. What I find interesting for me is how it forces you to rethink the discipline, its practice, etc. So in some ways, you know, will AI, because it's not at all, you have people who do think actually there are also technical issues. That's to say, you have people who say that we're so far from a generalist kind of AI that actually it might never, you know, exist. So there are raging debates around, you know, also about the relation between consciousness and the generalist character of all form of intelligence. So I'm not going to enter into this kind of form. Let's say I use these robotized and artificial intelligence driven in future, just like Jean-Jacques Rousseau used the origin. You know, I don't think Rousseau ever cared whether the origin was truly the origin, but it was a convenient starting point to think about the present.
Thank you.
That's great. I'm going to read a question from someone in the audience for Antoine. Thank you, Antoine. Do you see in AI a shift towards a universalized application of knowledge that human designers should resist in some way? Does more data create more specificity or less? Is our humanity made visible in the glitch?
Mm-hmm. Do you see in AI a shift?
Towards a universalized application of knowledge that human designers should resist.
I'm not sure it's knowledge. I think it has more to do with what the organizers have called exactitude. That's to say, and which I've tried to suggest that it's actually a very rational form of madness. So I think actually knowledge is somewhat lost in that process very often because, you know, we delegate to the machine, you know, these things. So is your humanities, does more data create more specificity or less? That I don't understand the precise sense of that question. Is humanity made visible in the glitch? Actually, strangely, these days, you know, for many, many years, I was completely irritated by Ruskin. And I found finally his idea of imperfection quite interesting. You know, the idea that in some ways, you know, one of the things we can do is precisely try to, you know, to epitomize a kind of wild character of things that perturbates mechanical arrangements, which I found interesting in this world.
Thank you. We have another question. Harry, Michael, do you want to read the next question from the audience?
Keep going, Laura.
Okay. All right, I'll take it then. All right. Next question for Antoine from Sunika Milosevic. Thank you, Antoine. My takeaway was that as humans, we have been striving to create architecture which emulates ourselves, and that with increasing tools and technology, we are striving to create buildings which think and breathe and function in interconnected systems similar to our own bodies. I'm thinking of energy efficient building skins, the monitoring building systems for energy, security, etc., which adapt per our use, occupancy need, etc. Is this a correct interpretation and a concept you would agree with?
My take is, you know, I would suggest that I've been saying other things also, but to rephrase it, I would say, yes, I do think something is going on around the question of animation in architecture and redefining what the animation of a building is. So, and yes, it goes with a more literal kind of emulation of life than what we knew traditionally. So yes, I say that as a sort of moment in the talk. I'm not sure this is the central issue I tried to promote, but yes, I did say something like that.
Right.
I'm going to read the next question from Ludmila Pavlova-Gillam. What might be the role of AI to the redistribution of space occupancy within the decision-making process of large corporations when they deal with real estate challenges post-COVID-19? In some ways, technology can today easily be applied to managing humans who are both adaptable and a human resource. How can architects assist in defining those human parameters that we value as democratic so that we don't serve as enforcers of inequality?
Well, small question. I would perhaps restart because I do think AI, you know, it's quite interesting by the way that, you know, in the 1950s, 1960s, there were a lot of architects interested actually in, you know, using computers to make decisions about, you know, space allocation. I'm thinking of Yona Friedman and others, etc. So it's tempting. And this is why I've introduced the notion of inhabiting, which is something inextricably physical and symbolic. And for me, one of the lessons post-COVID, look at us. We're all, one is in, I'm sure there is at least one person in the basement, another in the attic, others, etc. Inhabiting has taken, I think what I take from the COVID is actually this new urgency of thinking very hard about what it means to inhabit. And I think, in some ways, this is still, it might not be forever, which is what I said. I don't like the fact that we freeze forever what is human as opposed as what is not human. But inhabiting is for a while at least something that we're still the best place to evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if there are no more questions, we will say thank you to Antoine. Thank you so much, Antoine. And actually, wait a second. There's one question that's coming through my phone. So you noted the automatic potential of the Vitruvian orders. Among my students, those who most use permutative and iterative coding in design also apply to an aesthetic. We might fall humanist or Alberti by way of Kiriko. Sorry, it's a bit fragmented. Coincidence or consequence? And actually, I'm not really sure I get it myself, so I don't know how you're going to answer it. But let me see. One of my students, those who must use primitive and iterative coding in design also apply to an aesthetic. We might call humanist, perhaps. I don't know. We might call, yes, it's autocorrect. Humanist by way of Alberti or De Chirico. Coincidence or consequence? Does that make sense then?
Not completely sure, but one of the few things I learned in my Jesuit high school is that you can always answer a question that you've not fully understood.
Okay.
I think the paradox with the order, and it goes with what the eyes and other that I've used a number of times taken from Rimbaud, is that you take the order, they are supposed to be the very embodiment of the humanistic tradition in architecture. And they're at the same time the machine, the mechanical creeping in the discipline. So it shows how fragile is this notion of humanity as something that would be insulated from machines, etc., and from the Renaissance onwards. So this is probably what I would retain, and that the order of columns, they both point at, what could be, ultimately human, the beginning with the analogy with the body, etc., and they point toward the mechanical. And this is what I find fascinating. And this is where, in some ways, AI is just extending, in my opinion, a long tradition of questioning of, in some ways, architecture for me is an interesting discipline because it constantly questions the validity of, what it means to be human, which I don't think this is a new question actually in architecture.
Mm-hmm. Great. There's one more question that also came through my phone and now is on the screen. I'll read it to you. Your conversation about machines and inner otherness has a certain resonance with queer culture. The idea of the early humanoid machines, such as Frankenstein, who carry a streak of evil, has the same tone as the idea of I guess it's a psycho killer who is dressed as a woman, like in The Silence of the Lambs, as the expression of queerness that carries a certain evilness. If machines are the expression of an inner otherness, if a previously suppressed queerness is now a visible otherness, are we having the same conversation over and over again? Are we simply fighting a suppressed inner nature?
That's a difficult one for me because I don't want to say anything damaging about, queer culture, etc. And that's something, there is a long line actually of study which, you know, on the relation between gender identities or lack of refusal of identities or lack of identities, etc., and machine, you know, which extend to Haraway, you know, and, you know, the cyborg, you know, the cyborg in Haraway is also questioning, etc. I would say we are having again and again the same conversation because we don't know what we are. Which was, you know, for me, strangely, you know, we've taken architecture very often as the ultimate affirmation of, you know, the stability of the human in its definition, etc. The pyramids were there forever, etc. But I think architecture is also an expression of the inner instability of what it means to be human, and the fact that actually most received category can be challenged. So that would be my answer. Yes, this is probably the same. I think one of the reasons there is sometimes a fear of the machine is because we fear to discover that we're not what we believed we were. And strangely, this is what architecture is able sometimes to convey, strangely.
Thank you so much, Antoine, and thank you for taking more questions.
Thank
One
you.
of the luxuries of the ones that are adjacent to a break.